Welcome to Abdullah the Ethiopian Mystic, the channel that uncovers hidden African spiritual knowledge and the lives of forgotten mentors who shaped modern metaphysics. Here, we explore history, oral traditions, and the stories behind influential teachers like Abdullah, the Ethiopian mystic remembered through Neville Goddard. This is a space for curiosity, critical thinking, and reclaiming African intellectual heritage. Subscribe and join us as we journey into the mystery, wisdom, and influence of Africa's hidden minds.
Today I discuss Harlem in the 1930s, the spiritual intellectual scene. I welcome you again and thank you for joining us on this journey into the vibrant streets of Harlem in the 1930s. This was a time when African knowledge, Ethiopian mysticism, and intellectual awakening converged in a single neighborhood, shaping a generation of thinkers, artists, and spiritual seekers. In this video, we will explore the spiritual and intellectual scene of Harlem, a scene that nurtured creativity, consciousness, and a deep connection to African roots. We will meet the salons, churches, and cafes where ideas were debated, music inspired thought, and spirituality met intellect. For those curious about the history that shaped minds like Abdullah, this is a window into the heartbeat of Harlem's African spiritual and intellectual renaissance. Let's step into Harlem, a neighborhood alive with energy, rhythm, and the pursuit of identity, dignity, and knowledge. The first thing is the cultural historical backdrop. To understand Harlem's spiritual and intellectual life, we first need to place it in context. The 1930s were years of the Great Depression, racial segregation, and social upheaval. Jobs were scarce, poverty was common, yet Harlem thrived as a magnet for African American talent, creativity, and thought. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay were redefining literature, art, and identity. Jazz was more than music, it was a language of consciousness and expression. At the same time, a spiritual revival was taking root. Communities were seeking connection to African heritage, ancient wisdom, and Ethiopian-inspired spiritual practices. See this illustrative scenario. Imagine walking down Lenox Avenue in 1933. In a small cafe, young intellectuals gather around a table. The air is thick with smoke and ideas. One reads a passage from an Ethiopian history book, another recites a poem about African kings and queens, and a third debates the relevance of African spirituality to their daily lives. These moments were ordinary for Harlem residents, yet extraordinary for the African American community. They represent the fusion of African knowledge, Ethiopian mysticism, and Harlem 1930s spirituality. Pause a little. Harlem was not just a geographic location, it was a state of mind, a consciousness hub, and a spiritual incubator. Talking about the Ethiopianism, African spiritual movements. One of the most influential movements in Harlem was Ethiopianism. Ethiopianism was more than a religion. It was a philosophical and spiritual movement that connected African Americans to their roots. It emphasized pride in Africa, historical awareness, and spiritual empowerment. See this scenario. A Sunday morning in a Harlem church, 1934. Pastor said, "Our ancestors built empires, held wisdom, and honored the divine. We remember Ethiopia as a symbol of strength, dignity, and spiritual guidance." First congregant responded whispering, "It feels like we are finally seeing ourselves as we truly are." The second congregant exclaimed, "Yes, this knowledge restores our spirits, and reminds us that African wisdom is alive. Now, stay with me." In Harlem, Ethiopianism influenced not only churches but also community centers, independent spiritual groups, and even political gatherings. Leaders encouraged people to reclaim African heritage, combining spirituality with a sense of purpose and social consciousness. This revival also included music, poetry, and drama, where African mysticism informed storytelling, lyrical improvisation, and performance. You see that? In these gatherings, African knowledge and spiritual practices were inseparable, creating a unique environment of learning, reflection, and awakening. Another thing is Harlem's intellectual hubs. You need to be familiar with this. Harlem's intellectual hubs were another key pillar of its spiritual scene. Cafes, libraries, and salons became gathering places for thinkers, writers, and spiritual seekers. Imagine a cafe on 125th Street, evening, 1935. Where Langston Hughes repeatedly emphasizing that, we write not just for entertainment, but to awaken consciousness to remind our people of their history. And a young student curiously responding with questions saying how can we connect this to the spiritual practices of our ancestors? So also the poet answering, through memory, through storytelling, through the vibrations of music and ritual. These hubs were crucibles for African knowledge, fostering discussion on Ethiopian mysticism, African philosophy, and consciousness practices. They were spaces where the spiritual and intellectual intersected, and where African American leaders cultivated wisdom that influenced generations. Libraries and bookstores were also essential. Young minds pored over texts about African history, the Ethiopian church, and mystical traditions, blending academic rigor with spiritual reflection. Harlem intellectual hubs in the 1930s promoted African knowledge, Ethiopian mysticism, and spiritual consciousness across the community. Let's talk about the spiritual practices and daily life. Spirituality in Harlem was not abstract, it was lived in daily life. Residents practiced meditation, prayer, ritual, and African-centered mysticism as part of their routines. You would see a scene in the morning of Abdullah's study. Abdullah rises at dawn, opens a text on Ethiopian mysticism, and begins reflection. Abdullah, reading aloud, the soul must align with truth to manifest purpose in the world. He walks to a small cafe where intellectuals gather, discussing African philosophy and spiritual practice. Music, ritual, and debate flow together seamlessly. For the residents of Harlem, spiritual practice was inseparable from intellectual engagement. Their study, reflection, and daily rituals nurtured consciousness, identity, and resilience. Think about it. Consider how daily practices can connect us to history, wisdom, and spiritual power. Harlem 1930s spirituality blended African mysticism, Ethiopianism, and daily practices that empowered the community. The question is if there is any influence on Abdullah and broader impact. The spiritual and intellectual scene of Harlem shaped thinkers like Abdullah, whose work bridged African mysticism, consciousness, and philosophical inquiry. Ideally, in a quiet Harlem cafe, evening, you'll see Abdullah writing in journal, the past is alive in thought, African knowledge guides the present. Consciousness is the path to wisdom. When a friend said, your ideas resonate with Ethiopian teachings and the spirit of Harlem, Abdullah replied, yes, it is all connected: mind, spirit, community. Harlem's African spiritual and intellectual legacy created a foundation for African American consciousness, African-centered philosophy, and mysticism. It demonstrates how community, spirituality, and intellect converge to cultivate wisdom and purpose. Harlem 1930s spirituality and African knowledge shaped Abdullah's understanding of Ethiopian mysticism and intellectual awakening. For closing, Harlem in the 1930s shows us that spirituality and intellect are deeply intertwined. African knowledge, Ethiopian mysticism, and intellectual exploration were more than history, they were a living, breathing force shaping identity, consciousness, and community. If you enjoyed this journey into Harlem's spiritual and intellectual scene, like, share, and subscribe for more explorations of African mysticism, consciousness, and history. Comment below, which Harlem figure or spiritual movement inspires you the most? In reflection, remember the wisdom of the past. It is better to live in calm than in constant pursuit of what society demands. May we seek truth with humility, walk in faith with awareness, and honor our identity with dignity. May wisdom guide our thoughts, and peace dwell in our hearts with consciousness. Type consciousness in the comment section too, and I will add you to my favorite list for more of this. Thank you. This is Abdullah the Ethiopian.